So we're going to talk about word order change in Icelandic today. So we'll start with a bit of background. We're going to be talking about verb-first and verb-second in the language. So it's widely accepted that Icelandic is a verb-second language, but it also has a wide variety of V1 constructions, including various types of V1 declaratives. We've given an example in one here, and we'll come back to the different types later on. Now, what's been claimed in the literature previously is that we have a diachronic change going on in the history of Icelandic, whereby V1 decreases and V2 increases over time. This was claimed by Sigurdsson in the 1990s and has been confirmed by more recent corpus studies. Nevertheless, a full account of this change and its driving factors is still lacking. The second thing we're going to talk about today, or what our sort of talk hinges on, is how grammatical relations in Icelandic are encoded. And it's well known that the encoding of grammatical relations in the language is highly complex, and there's a pretty big literature on this, in particular in connection with the existence of quirky or non-nominative subjects. And let's just say for the time being that grammatical relations are encoded by a complex interaction of morphology, word order, and lexical semantics. And this is true throughout the history of the language, but there is some diachronic change going on. In particular, it's been claimed that position over time becomes an increasingly important encoding strategy for grammatical relations. This has been framed by some authors in terms of the rise of configurationality, or in terms of the rise of positional licensing in Kaspersky's work, where it's been suggested that position is becoming the dominant encoding strategy over time. Okay, so in this talk, what we want to do is bring these two changes together, what's going on with V1 and V2, and what's going on with encoding of grammatical relations, in an account where we focus in particular on the interaction between clause structure and information structure. So we're kind of bringing in information structure as an additional dimension here. The claims we're making today are supported by quantitative and qualitative corpus evidence from the Icelandic past historical corpus, or IceBeck, which we are always very grateful to have available to us. We'll be focusing on matrix declaratives in particular, and we'll be taking a close look at what's going on in terms of the verb position and the position of subject topics. For the formal analysis, we're working within lexical functional grammar, or LFG. And as many of you will know, in LFG, clause structure, grammatical relations, and information structure are captured at independent but interacting dimensions. And as we'll show, this architecture of LFG allows us to neatly capture the changing associations over time. So let's just bring in a little bit of background on LFG to set that up. We'll try and couch what we have to say in more generalized terms, but we will resort to some LFG formalism later on. So let's just have a look at some basics. So LFG assumes this parallel architecture where you've got different types of linguistic information represented at these different dimensions which interact with one another. And there's one proposal for how that architecture looks like by Asha Sude, shown here. Most of the details won't be relevant to us today, but what's important specifically for our talk is that subjects are represented at F structure, and so they don't need to be associated with a fixed structural position necessarily. And likewise, information structural properties, for example, topicality, they're also captured at a separate dimension, I structure, which you can see up here in Asude's architecture. So information structural properties also need not necessarily be associated with a single position. So then C structure is a dimension which represents purely information concerning category and constituency. And we'll then talk to F structure and I structure. So let's have a little look at that. Here's sort of an example setting that out, just a simple example with English. What did Maria buy? Maria bought a cactus. Here in the answer to that question, we're assuming that Maria, the subject, is a topic, and a cactus, the object, is a focus. And then we represent the constituent structure at LFG C structure here. And then we have various mapping relations relating C structure nodes to I structure, so where information structure is captured, and also mapping relations relating C structure nodes to F structure, where grammatical relations are captured, among other things. Okay, the final thing we need to set up before we take a look at the data is what we mean by topics. So we're in treacherous water when it comes to information structural terminology, so let's just say a little bit about this. We're taking a feature-based approach to information structure following previous proposals. And in this approach, we assume basically two binary features, plus or minus new, plus and minus prominent. And then from these two binary features, you have a four-way division which fall out from those features, as you can see in the table there. So in such an approach, topic is essentially anything which is minus new and plus prominent. And this is what we'll be talking about when we talk about topicality today. So topic here is largely equivalent to the concept of continuing topic in Frascarelli and Hinterhutzel's work. There will be some overlap with aboutness topics, but we won't have anything too specific to say about aboutness topics. Okay, then a little methodological point connected with that. So IcePack is useful in many ways, but it's not annotated for information structure. So when we're trying to get quantitative data relating to information structure, we need to use an approximation for topics. And today we'll be looking at subject topics, as we've mentioned, and there the approximation we use is that we say that, okay, any referential subject noun phrase which is pronominal or which has overt definite marking will take to be a subject topic. Now, we're well aware that there's various issues with this approximation. Obviously, not all pronominal and definite noun phrase subjects will be topics. And on the other hand, because definiteness marking is not yet obligatory for semantically definite noun phrases in early stages of the language, we won't be actually capturing all semantically definite NPs via this approximation. So we are aware of the limitations here, but on balance, we feel that having quantitative data which represents at least an approximation at this point outweighs the alternatives, which is either to not look at information structure at all, or essentially to not do quantitative work, but work with small amounts of sort of manually tagged data. So this is the approximation. We're nevertheless regularly doing additional qualitative checks to monitor what's going on in the data. And when we look at this approximation, we are finding that when you take a closer look at the context, that most of them do seem to be what we want to call subject topics. Okay, so let's look at the data then. So Old Icelandic, like the modern language, is standardly recognized as a verb-second variety. And we've got some classic examples in 3, 4, and 5. Corpus studies confirm that verb-second is indeed robustly attested in matrix declaratives, right? In the Old Icelandic text in IcePack, they're attested in 82% of cases. And the only exception we get to verb-second is the V1 declaratives, which we've mentioned. And it's quite notable here that in Old Icelandic, you don't get the verb third and verb later than third word orders that you get across early West Germanic. So really the only option is V1. And there, as I've said, we can distinguish different types, at least 3 different types. And these are the 3 types we'll talk about today. Impersonal constructions, which are typically V1 constructions in Old Icelandic, as in 6 with a weather predicate. Then presentational constructions, which are also most often V1 constructions in Old Icelandic. And we won't have too much specific things to say about these today, but we'll come back to them at the end. What we're going to focus on for the main bit of the talk is a 3rd type of V1 construction, which has attracted quite a lot of attention in the literature. That is narrative inversion V1. narrative inversion term going back to Platt's 1985, I believe. Okay, so here's that narrative inversion construction once again. Now, it's been noted that it's a construction which is characteristic of lively storytelling. It occurs typically in reported sequences of events. It can't really initiate a discourse, and there's a big literature on that. What's relevant for us today is that in this construction, you have a subject topic in the immediately post-finite position, right? Verb and then subject topic. Okay, so taking V2 and then the narrative inversion V1, we have then two positions available to subject topics in Old Icelandic, right? The pre-field, what we'll call the pre-field, the clause initial pre-finite position in a V2 context, and then in this special type of V1, the immediately post-finite position. So we have a look at what the precise positional distribution of subject topics is across these two positions in the corpus. And we find that the relative ordering of the finite verb and subject topic is indeed flexible. Again, just looking at Old Icelandic for the time being. But you have a preference for the V2 option, right? So pre-field subject topic in a V2 construction 66% of the time, compared to 34% post-finite subject topic in the narrative inversion construction. Okay, so let's sketch an analysis then for the situation in Old Icelandic. So we've seen that we've got word order flexibility concerning the finite verb and subject topic. And in our account, we assume then that we've got two subject topic positions which pivot around a fixed position for finiteness. As you can see in the tree 11. So we're assuming an IP rooted account with a flat structure within I bar, which captures the word order freedom that you have in the post-finite domain in this early stage. And we're following previous accounts for modern Scandinavian within LFG there. And then, of course, you've got one available pre-finite position, spec IP, which can be optionally occupied. It's occupied in V2 contexts, in V1 contexts, it's not. So here's how that bears out for the two constructions we've seen. On the left here, we show the correspondences for V2 with a clause initial subject topic. And on the right, then you've got the correspondences for V1 with a post-finite subject topic, the narrative inversion construction. So the difference here is captured at C structure, but also in the mappings or correspondences between C structure and I structure and C structure and F structure, captured by the arrows here. Okay, so obviously this analysis contrasts with some accounts which handle the flexible order of a finite verb and subject topic in terms of a classic CP-IP structure where you've got a fixed subject position, right? As in some of the classic analyses of verb-second, as Sigurdsson 1990 proposes specifically for Icelandic. But most of these accounts are proposed within approaches where subjects are structurally defined. And we see them as being really motivated by the assumption that spec IP, typically spec IP in most of the accounts, is a unique subject position. Now, as we've seen, LFG takes a more abstract view of subjecthood and topicality, right, capturing them at different dimensions. So this means we're not tied to definitely having a fixed position for subjects or for topics. And we feel that the IP-rooted account better captures what we see as the key intuition borne out by the data. That is that the position of the finite verb is highly restricted, right? Recall that you don't get verb third and verb later than third word orders in the Old Icelandic data. We should say that this structural restriction is then in contrast to the post-finite domain, where, as we've mentioned, word order is pretty free and seems to be driven by information structural concerns. Christin and I have showed that in previous work. And we should also say that this IP-rooted account is also in line with previous LFG accounts, which capture some second position phenomenon via this IP-rooted C structure. And that's been proposed for second position phenomena across a wide variety of languages. Okay, so I'll hand over to Christin now, who will take you through the later stages of Icelandic.
Yes. So what we did next was we investigated the positional distribution of subject topics in relation to the finite verb over time by means of looking at three different word order patterns. So we looked at subject topic initial V2 constructions and narrative inversion V1 constructions as before. And we also included a third type of word order pattern. And we also looked at non-subject topic initial V2 clauses, such as in 14 here. Next slide, please. And then first we took a broader view at the data and compared the Old Icelandic proportion in the data with some modern Icelandic data from 1900 to 2008. And what we found is that subject topics over time increasingly target the prefield, so spec IP. So if you look at the table here, what you can see is that subject topic initial V2 clauses increase their share from 43% to 71%, while the other two constructions are decreasing over time. Then we did a more detailed investigation of the development of the word orders across individual texts, which then allows us to look at the full Icelandic diachrony from 1150 to 2008. For statistical testing of the effect of time on the individual word orders, we computed generalized linear mixed effect models and took year as fixed effect, and we also integrated genre as fixed effect because there's a well-known genre effect in IcePack. And in addition, we included text as random effect. Next, please. Yeah. So for the first word order for subject topic initial V2 clauses, we found that over time there is a continuous increase, and this increase is statistically significant. Nevertheless, there's some variation around 1600 to 1700, which we attributed to this well-known genre effect. And indeed, we found that biographical texts from around this time period have a significant negative effect, which plays out in terms of that little dip in the blue smooth line in the curve here in the figure. Okay, next, please. Narrative inversion V1, on the other hand, is decreasing over the whole time frame, and this decrease over time is statistically significant as well. But again, we have some variation around 1600 to 1700, so again we have a genre effect here, and again we found that a specific genre, this time religious texts, have a significant negative effect here on the distribution this time. But overall, we see a continuous decrease. The non-subject topic initial V2 pattern is decreasing as well. However, that decrease did not turn out to be statistically significant because genre has a significant impact on the distribution on the whole. So we found a significant positive effect of biographies and religious texts, in particular around 1600 again, which explains that large increase of the curve, but there's variation across the board. So there's a lot of stylistic variance as well. But overall, we take this overall decrease to be indicating that the construction is on the verge of following the fate of narrative inversion, and it's on its way out in the long run. Okay, next, please. So the data shows that subject topics increasingly favor the prefield throughout the history of Icelandic. And this in turn can be interpreted as the change in the association between class structure and information structure and grammatical relations. In terms of LFG, this plays out as a change in the association between C and I structure and F structure as well. And overall, on the basis of the data, we claim that the prefield, so spec IP, is emerging as a unique subject topic position over time. In that spec IP is becoming more restricted to subject topics, and the post-finite domain is losing its association with subject topics in turn. And overall, this development is in line with the wider shift towards positional licensing of grammatical relations, which has been proposed by Kiparski and which we've also argued for in our own previous work. Thus, over time, the subject-topic initial V2 structure, so subject initial V2 structure we saw earlier, becomes generalized. And this is the type of construction or this type of structure where the clause initial spec IP position becomes firmly associated with topics and subjects in turn. So now I'm handing back over to Hannah, who is going to report on the consequences of this change.
Yeah, so thinking back to what's going on with V1 and V2 over time, we can say that the changing association, which Christin's just set out, we think at least partly accounts for the developments concerning V1 and V2. Remember, that's that V1 is decreasing and V2 is increasing over time. So narrative inversion V1 is becoming less frequent, right? That's one type of V1 construction. It's losing out to the structure on the left here, right? As the subject topics increasingly favor the prefield. So we're losing these associations as these ones get stronger. But this is not the whole story with respect to what's going on with V1 in the history of Icelandic, right? Because remember, narrative inversion V1 is just one specific type. So what about the other types of V1 which don't involve subject topics? So remember, we introduced impersonal V1 constructions, as with weather predicates in 15, and the presentational V1 constructions in 16. So both of these construction types surface as V1 in Old Icelandic. But it's been observed previously that there's also a change going on with these constructions. So just as narrative inversion V1 decreases over time, these impersonal and presentational V1 constructions also decrease over time. And that's been confirmed by various studies. And what's going on here is that the V1 constructions gradually lose out to the rise of V2 structures with a pre-field expletive thar. So compare the impersonal and presentational V1 constructions with an empty prefield, so to speak, with later versions here from the year 2008, where now we've got thar as an expletive in that prefield position. And we should say that thar is positionally restricted to this position. Okay, so impersonal and presentational constructions, in contrast to the narrative inversion construction, are inherently topicless, right? And it's been proposed, therefore, in line with the positional restriction on the expletive, that what the expletive is doing in the prefield in these contexts is signaling that the clause lacks a topic. So we see, therefore, resting on these assumptions, that the rise of this prefield expletive thar, and thus in turn the decrease in V1 in another set of contexts, in the impersonals and the presentationals, can also be viewed as a consequence of the change which we've proposed today. So the idea is that as your prefield is increasingly strongly characterized as a subject-topic position, the expletive will be increasingly motivated as a structural fillet for that position, right, in clauses where you haven't got anything to go there, right, in clauses which lack a subject topic. So that's a sketch of one of the consequences which we think ties in with this change. So in sum, we can say that we've got two diachronic developments going on concerning V1 and V2 in the history of Icelandic. On the one hand, the first thing we've seen is that narrative inversion V1 is being lost to verb-second constructions with an initial subject topic. And then the second change, which we've just sketched out briefly today, is that impersonal and presentational V1 constructions are being lost to V2 clauses with that initial expletive in the prefield. So what we can say, therefore, sort of broader picture, is that V1 declaratives in Icelandic are gradually being eroded on at least two fronts. And this can all be traced back to the overall changing association between clause structure and information structure, and clause structure and grammatical relations, which we've sketched out today, namely the fact that we've got the gradual emergence over time of a unique subject topic position in the language. So I think we'll stop there. Thank you.